So we just watched Reservation Dogs, the episode Come and Get Your Love, and the Rutherford Falls episode Adirondack. And I recognize the dangers of members of one specific tribe speaking for all Native Americans. But at the same time, we all bring our lived experiences to a text, and in this case, a TV show. So I think our guests tonight have a unique perspective to share. We're joined this evening by members of the Catawba Nation, Beckee Garris, Alex Osborn, Sharon Simmers-Norton, and Drew George Warren. Yeah, the weird thing is I wrote their names down in that order.
Also, it's Rue, not Andrew.
And Rue. Also Rue. All right, well, let's any immediate comments.
I want to hear the questions.
You want to hear the questions?
Yeah.
All right. So let's start talking about that episode of Rutherford Falls. I mean, I do think they nailed it that everyone's mom loves Yellowstone. Absolutely do. But I'm wondering if any of y'all have had experiences with TV, film, production companies, that sort of thing, consulting or otherwise, and were those experiences similar to this, or different, or vastly different, or exactly the same?
I like small productions, but just literally a conversation, nothing like an actual like stage show. But what I loved about the episode was that it's very clear, like even if you don't know Jana, the head writer for it, the star, that she's obviously had to do those before in her life, and possibly even for Yellowstone or something, because just the exasperation she had with it. It's very relatable, even if it's not in the film industry.
I haven't had any for film, but I have for design. I'm a graphic designer in my day job, right? And in previous projects and in working with different people on different things, you get some very stereotypical notions of what Native American design looks like. And also like, that's kind of an explanation in and of itself, because, Catawba design looks different than Cherokee or, Tlingit or, any other tribe that's out there. And so I think that media has brought on this narrative of like, this is what Indigenous looks like. And sometimes you fit into that circle and sometimes you don't. So it's interesting.
Beckee, you had a publishing experience, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from what you told me, that was a pleasant experience.
Yes, it was.
Say a little bit about it.
Probably because it was all over emails, never in person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we had been contacted about adding one of our stories in a book, but they wanted to do it in graphic form, which has never been done by any tribe at all, because everything has always been passed orally. So I had to get permission from the elders within the church. That time I wasn't quite an elder, so I had to go to the information. And so it was done that way. And actually in 2012, that book got the ASOP Award for Children's Literature.
It's called Trickster.
Yeah, Trickster. Native American. Yes.
Did they change your story at all, or did they?
No, whatever I submitted, that's exactly what they put in there. And I never met the artist who drew that one, a particular one. And whenever it came out, people looked at it and said, when did he meet you? Because it was,
I haven't read all of it, but the art in it is really cool.
So it was, they used native storytellers to tell the story, and then.
But all the graphic artists weren't necessarily native, but it worked out.
So I actually did filming for Banshee.
Yeah.
Oh.
And they had us, so they were looking for Native Americans. There were a ton of non-natives that ended up filling the role. But the scene was always run down single line trailers. and that was the reservation. It was all like poor.
Yeah.
Poverty type.
Which I find it interesting too, because like, do any of y'all sometimes feel like there's elements of truth, but then it's like, why does it have to be portrayed that way too? Because like, you go to parts of different reservations and there are, poverty is a huge issue within Native American communities. And so like, there's a grain of truth to that, but there's also like kind of a respect nuance that's crossed of like why, do y'all notice that too?
Yeah.
Well, it's like in reservation dogs, they talk about, they do talk about things that tribes Native people get stereotyped for, like substance abuse, domestic violence, just suicide, like all these things that are facts. But it's the way that they're able to do it. Like they have enough knowledge about the context that they're actually able to do it in a way that like we can laugh about it and not feel like we're being laughed at.
And for me, it actually really does make a huge difference that all of the writers for Reservation Dogs are Indigenous. So like, I know that these are coming from lived experiences. It's also coming from like the communities that are being represented. So it carries a little bit of a different weight than if you see a spaghetti western.
Yeah. And there's just like little tropes that I don't know about y'all, but just getting like a sixth sense about like, oh, I know this wasn't written by a Native person.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Obviously they were over the top with the Adirondack thing, but it's like, for example, the Native people needing a white spokesperson to articulate their claims, and like they even did it in the way that they set up the blocking. So like the guy who's in regalia, whose grandparents are the trees, the white guy keeps stepping in front of him like every time they need to speak, and so you just start picking up on those little tropes, I think, and you're like, oh, this is not written by a Native person.
I think it's my own issue, but like anytime I see a like traditional headdress, quote unquote, then I'm like, I immediately have trust issues.
Yes.
I'm like, this is probably not genuine.
Immediate trust issues.
Right.
Well, it's not necessarily always in the media, but at the same time, sometimes conceptions are from what people have seen or heard through the media. Like I had a woman to contact me, actually this week. She wanted me to come to speak at her interdenominational church, but she wanted me to come on the 15th at 12 o'clock. And she just, and she just contacted me, and I politely told her, well, I'm sorry, I've got things we're doing, and I don't do a work, but we're preparing for our festival on November 19th. And so then she wanted to know if I knew anybody else who could come, and I said, not this lady. But the thing about it was, she said, well, can I help promote your festival? And I said, absolutely. And so I gave her the dates and told her what was going to be going on. And she thanked me, and then she said, oh, by the way, will your festival be appropriate for middle school and high school kids? Yeah.
We'll see what I can do.
But you know,
Because we run around in one class.
I politely wrote it back and I said, absolutely appropriate for them. And then I was telling people, I said, but I almost told her, except for 12 o'clock noon when we are doing human sacrifices.
That's what the cannibals. Well, but you're so right though about like this is how the vast majority of non-Native people learn about Native people, which is through the media. I mean, there was a study out of Pennsylvania University, 2018, that found that 90% of state-mandated textbooks don't mention tribes after 1900. So what is the lesson that these kids are getting? That Native people are in the past, that we don't exist anymore. And it's not like at some point in your life, becoming a professional, a doctor, a police officer, a Supreme Court justice, that you actually ever are sat down and said, okay, this is actually what tribes are, this is what Indian law is, and not to make it too political, but that was what was on display yesterday when the Supreme Court was hearing the Indian Child Welfare Act, which protects our children, and the complete ignorance that these people were showing. It's because we don't get talked about in serious ways when the opportunity is there. And then oftentimes we're treated like those showrunners were treating it like, oh, well, let's just figure out how to make it work, you know?
I think one other thing with that too is like, there are many times where you seeing, like being in the show or something, like people will say, oh, well, my ancestor was such and such. And like, and I never want to invalidate someone's experience as like, that's who your ancestor was. That is absolutely valid, but there's so much more of a nuanced conversation between like the art and things that we create and the way that we represent ourselves than just our ancestors. Like our ancestors, my future ancestors are sitting right next to me. You know, like we're honestly, that we're connected in ways like that is part of our culture. And by someone just saying like, oh well, the joke is my grandmother was an Indian or Cherokee princess. Yeah, full blood. Yeah. And again, that's not to disrespect anyone or dismiss their experience, but that is not a respectful way to relate to what we're sharing.
I'm thinking more and more there's a distinction, we should make a distinction between having Native ancestry and being Native.
Yes.
These are two
Yeah, well, this is, I mean, again, bring it back to the Supreme Court, because I will, but that is the exact misunderstanding, which is the idea that we are races or a race of people and not as citizens of political bodies, right? And that is what the Indian Child Welfare Act is based on, that's what Indian law is based on, is the fact that we are citizens of tribal nations, not that we may or may not have an ancestor or that we took a DNA test or whatever.
And also being like active within your culture. Like I have ancestry that goes back to Scotland, but I don't wear a kilt.
Yeah.
Like
no one asked me when they had their election.
Right, and it's valid. Like my family was in Scotland in 1700 something, but that's different than living in Scotland, eating haggis and wearing a kilt every day, and that I think I'm pretty proud of that example.
Well, I do own a kilt, but it was my wedding kilt.
That's no disrespect to kilts.
Well, I can pull it up. Sorry,
I was gonna say also, people seem to want, well, they don't want, they do. They want to dissect us. And say, well, how much blood, are you full blood, or are you full Indian? And I've come up with my responses when I'm asked. They ask me if I'm a full Indian, and I said, it depends on whether I've eaten yet or not. And if they ask me if I'm a full blood, and I say yes, because I haven't donated to Red Cross this week.
So you kind of touched on this, but I want to kind of circle back to it. Because the scene where in Rutherford Falls, where Reed comes in onto the set, and there's a mismatch of things, and Michael's right. And
yeah,
that's more traditional than Michael's.
Now that is so funny.
Something more indigenous. But what are your thoughts on this, though? I mean, how is that done well, and how is it done poorly when, just if we look at the actors in these shows, the tribal group in Rutherford Falls is a made-up, right? So you have actors from different tribal backgrounds, and even in Reservation Dogs, I think they're supposed to be Creek, if I'm not mistaken. But most of the actors are all over the great West Cherokee. Right. So how do you negotiate? How's that done well?
Can you rephrase the question slightly?
I don't know.
I do want to point out though, I thought that line was funny because the actor's name is Michael Gray.
Yes.
So we're going to say like, come what can be
What's
more
more
indigenous than Michael's?
Well,
And they do a lot of wordplay too.
yes, yeah.
So you're asking, like, what is authentic about
Well,
that?
so often it's done very poorly.
Yeah.
That you have, well, you have a Latino actor who identifies primarily as Latino playing a native character.
What's the
And
red
then
flags?
wearing a, you have the
Yeah.
plain headdress of the Eastern tribes and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing. I mean, what's the,
So I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
Are you asking like, what are the red flags for us to
I
know
think so,
that it's
yeah.
like not
There you go.
genuine?
That's a good question, yeah.
I think any mention of Cherokee Princess,
Yeah.
the headdresses for me, like I joke and say that it's a trust issue, but that's like that's become a really like noticeable trope in modern cinema is like the big feathered headdress. I mean, we wore, there are examples here, I think, but we wore like turkey feather crowns, essentially. We never, I mean, we did, but there's like complicated, there are complicated stories of why we had wore bonnets, but those were not traditionally within our tribe.
Well, they were gifted.
They were gifted,
Gifted,
yes,
yeah.
exactly.
And also,
And
the
we did not
crown,
live in teepees.
Oh, right. Because they were
Right.
homes.
and actually the crown came about after King of England. Before that, they either wore one or two feathers in the hair. And it wasn't, you don't go by warrior status as far as your feathers. It was a matter of, you just wore them more like hair ornaments, not necessarily that you were gifted with one. Other than now, yes, we've incorporated the eagle feathers in our ceremonies and things, but that's also more contemporary.
I think something for me is that it becomes very disingenuous when there is a generalization made. And that like, that's really the flag for me. If people are talking about, if I hear a specific tribe, you know, like someone is referencing, this is the artwork of the Haida, this is representative of Muskogee, this is representative of those things, like you kind of learn to clue in on someone who actually knows what they're talking about and who they're talking about and how they're talking, as opposed to like, oh, this is Native American, or this pattern was loved by the Indians here. And I know that that's like becoming more, I'm saying that more as, you know, satire or whatever, but.
Yeah, and I think also even before like the aesthetics, like what are the specific outfits that you're choosing, what are the specific props that you're using? I think it starts with the script and the story that's being told. Like there was a moment where Terry in Rutherford Falls is like, oh my gosh, I thought we got rid of the ceremony scene, like what are you doing? And the guy's like, oh, well, we need that so that he can then later have this moment where it's adopted. And it's like, yeah, but that would actually be where I honed in immediately, which is that these native characters only exist for this settler character, this white character to develop, right? And so that is, to me, a big thing. Is like, are these Black characters, are these rounded characters? Do they have a purpose? Do they have a life outside of this this guy who's not native, who's there, who needs to have this journey?
Yeah, it goes back to last time. He thinks it goes back to
Last
the
week,
Lone
yeah.
Ranger. Or the television.
Dance with Wolves.
Yeah,
like
I love the example of horror.
Yeah.
So my partner plays video games and really loves horror video games and movies, and I've grown to love them too. So that's like a new thing for me. But one thing that I almost always have to like brace myself for is anything Stephen King, because there is almost always a tropism of Native American mysticism in his work. And that's been like publicly talked about, so that's not defamatory as a you know, whatever. But the specific example was like the first time I saw Pet Cemetery, and you know, there's this whole storyline arc of like Native American burial ground and things like that, and I just don't. And often like Native American folklore, and I say that inclusive of many tribes, is so cool. Like there's so many neat stories.
And rich and diverse.
Right, in our culture, but then also in other tribes. And so like talking about different, creatures or spirits and things. Sometimes not only is that like, just like, you kind of start to roll your eyes because you get tired of seeing it, it can be really offensive too. And I think that people don't really understand the depth of, saying, well, this is going to be a plot device in my story, based on the episode or whatever. Whereas those are really like important things to our people sometimes.
Yeah, actually, sorry, did you want to say?
Don't talk about
I was reading a comic book that had a Deer Woman character in it. And it's so interesting because the way it was portrayed in that comic book is so different from this, where in the comic book, it was just an evil creature, right? Like this thing has no goal, has no purpose, doesn't have a life. And in here, it's like, oh, she's scary, like I'm scared of her, but she has a purpose and she has a situation in the universe that they take into account and that they're able to flesh out in a way that is often flattened in that other stuff.
And also she was badass and I want to see more.
Yeah. There's a spin off for Deer Woman.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, she's running for mayor.
Oh.
This is one of the things about both of these shows that these two, Dark Skies and there was another one that there's a certain group of actors who just keep popping up.
Oh, yeah.
And they're great, but it's sort of like, oh, it's that guy, oh, it's that woman.
And part of that was because this is the first time that they really had, for a lot of these actors, been working for years, like Wes Studi, the guy who plays Big, worked for years and years and years. And this is one of the first times that they're getting a chance to actually try things, to like actually have the support to show off their acting ability. And so a lot of times there's not a big bench for actors that are out there. I know that that was a specific thing that they were struggling with in casting young people in Reservation Dogs, was like there's not a cohort of necessarily young native actors out there because they don't really get opportunities except to be in the background or whatever.
I think to I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something really cool.
one of our folks online, Catherine Price, mentioned the native version of the Beckee test. If you're familiar with the Beckee test, it does this film, television show, what have you, have two women talking to each other without talking about the other male characters. They're just interacting as two female characters who are fully developed, that sort of thing. I think that perhaps you could apply that to these shows. That are they talking to the white savior, whatever figure?
Are they talking about like the whole council meeting about this one guy, like they're not willing to make him work or try?
Also, like another thing that I've noticed is that like our stories speak for themselves. They don't really require like the mystic or mysticism, spiritualism part of it. They don't require any additions. They've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And so I think like that is an odd pH test for me too, is like, are you embellishing on this story as a plot device, or is this story speaking for itself? And that, because I don't feel like that really, if this is going to be part of your story, then it can be part of the story on its own, as opposed to like embellished.
Well, as far as embellishing, some of our stories can play off of each other to interconnect so that it's a fuller story instead of just one segment.
Yes.
Or just a plot device or a tool for some unrelated story.
Yeah, but as far as getting back to where you're talking about different ethnic people in the movies playing Native people, sometimes if they've got the look, they get the part without having any connections to who they're actually, and plus they are acting.
Yeah. And it is, a lot of these shows do have, the ones that sort of are out now, do have a lot of actors like Wes Studi, who have been around a while and have been in some really bad things. And you sort of feel like, thank goodness that he's got a role that he can really,
I mean, they made a joke about Adam Beach, right?
Yeah.
Falls. Like, oh, this is where Adam Beach dies in the first 10 minutes of every movie, because that's all the kind of character he is. Right?
Yeah. But let's see. Another question, we'll pull these as they're coming up online. This is from Jackie Adams. Reservation Dogs, what do you think the show handles particularly well that viewers should hone in?
think it does a really, really good job of talking about intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing. Particularly in the second season, it's really focused on grief, and not just grief for their friend who has completed suicide, but also the grieving process for a grandmother figure. And that is just, I mean, I know it's a part of everyone's life, right? It's both extraordinary and mundane, but it is also, I mean, tribes, the life expectancy, the likelihood of dying in X, Y, or Z situation is much higher. And so death is just a really common, and tragic death is a really common thing in tribal communities. And so it's something that tribes are constantly trying to figure out. And oftentimes younger folks trying to figure it out without necessarily having those rich traditions of grief that help move people through that moment because of the history of colonialism taking a lot of that away. So that's what I really love about it.
This might go without saying, but I think that it also does a really good job with relatability. Sorry, did I say that? With relatability, just, you know, that representation piece is really important and real. And it's neat to see, even in other tribes, how, like, because we have some shared experiences historically, that like, oh yeah, that was that was in my family too, you know, like that it does a neat job of kind of calling that out pretty specifically to other Native people and Indigenous people.
Sure.
I was just gonna say that they picked up a lot on the mental illness, and played on that with the death of Benjamin. And so it took me a minute, like I wasn't exactly sure why he committed suicide, and I'm still kind of left sort of wondering.
Which is usually the case.
Right. But I think that they were trying to pull out the whole parents will didn't watch the scene, but I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, no, hopefully folks will watch or watch
Okay.
this.
Well, because I am of the elder age, I couldn't get past all the cousins.
But relatable.
But I mean,
I still couldn't get past it. You know what I'm saying? Okay, they really have gone into the colonialism word speak. So there are no cuss words in native language.
Yes.
that we know of. I'm sure they cussed.
I'm sure there's cursing.
There was some kind of,
Yeah. Well, and I think that's sort of what you're all saying is the relatability of something. I think, not that I was asked this question, but I'm an English professor, I profess, that you have the very specific and the general, that grief is a universal experience, and you know, loss of a loved one, all of these sorts of things, and mental illness, and these are universal experiences, but you also see that handled in a very specific context, in a specific cultural context, that instead of being ethnographic film, I guess we're not watching TV shows, documentary shows about these people. We're watching art, right? Or pop art, but it's art.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, like, it's both specific but general. Like, it's like there's how many tribes? 570 plus tribes in the United States, spread out from the swamps of Florida to the barren tundra, the cold tundras of Alaska. And so there's moments like there's a big moment that went around the internet was when they had an owl figure and its eyes were censored or something. And like that's not something that I grew up hearing about in my community, at least people I'm around, about owls. I know it's true of a lot of tribes. So there's those moments of specificity. But then there's also the moments that we can relate to across tribes, like the Indian Health Service scenes is so funny.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
no, it was not hilarious when she marked her as something else.
Fair.
Yeah, with the-
But also,
Again, accurate.
but that's an example of like when people come into our community and they like expect to know our needs.
Well, so I correlated that with the no, the elections. When they marked natives were something else.
You know, I think too, something that what you said and this like kind of makes me think of is that I hear a lot about, I have a lot of discussions around like gender identity and sexuality and things like that, just me and friends. And intersectionality is really important to consider whenever you're trying to communicate with people. And what dawned on me just now is that like everybody has like layers of experiences, you know, so you could be Native American, straight, married, have 3 kids, you know, but then somebody else who is, you know, Latino woman, bisexual, and, you know, a whole different set of experiences. And I think what these shows do for some of us is it tells stories within our, like a similar combination of our experiences. You know, so like it speaks to like different elements of who we are as a person, and that's not common for us.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that was really interesting because it's like telling stories from a similar intersectional space, and that is really hard to find, especially in a small tribe like ours. You know, so like it's and within different tribes, and I think that's pretty cool.
But also getting back to, you know, the media and everything else. I did not see it, but it's been all over Facebook where this reporter had talked about indigenous creatures. We're indigenous creatures now. And so I think, yeah, so, and that kind of gets back to, I don't know if she studied history or not, but that's back whenever they first took some indigenous people back to Italy. And the Pope had said, oh, there are other human-like creatures on this earth that we can't explain, because they were basing it on the races came from the 3 sons of Abraham. So,
look, I'm happy to be a scary monster.
so we can be creatures.
I want to circle back to the owl reference because so both of these shows, both Rutherford Falls and Reservation Dogs, and I think Dark Skies that was out on AMC earlier this year, Tony Hillerman novel that is treated very respectfully. I think. But all of these shows have indigenous producers and at least some of the writers, if not all of the writers. I heard the story that when Ed Helms was working on Rutherford Falls, and they wanted to have part of the story to be this casino in this native nation, that they went and they saw that. They said, we've got to find a native producer to work on this. We've got to find at least half the writing room has to be native. And then with Reservation Dogs, you have Sterling Parjo and
Take away CT.
thank you. I was going to trouble with that one, who not Native American, but is of indigenous Australian.
Maori.
Maori. So I think that infuses these things, and I think to a certain degree, and I've heard the people from these shows talk about it, these in-jokes that are in there. Of course, the Indian Health Service is not something that non-native people experience, so we don't have that relationship with it. It's still funny, but we don't experience it on the same level. The owls, the blurring of the owls, so even in native culture, it's not necessarily across the board. I'm wondering though about using the same actor to play the producer, director, writer, head writer, and so forth on Rutherford Falls.
And he's inclined that.
Is the implication what I would assume it is?
I feel like it might be like this, the interchangeable.
Yeah.
Like kind of flipping it on head, like it's an interchangeable white guy as opposed to an interchangeable.
That's kind of what I picked up on it too. Yeah.
That's funny.
I just thought they were triplets.
I thought that at first. I was like, oh, they're twins. Okay.
I didn't realize it was the same person.
But then I was like,
changed his hat, and I was like, oh, this is a new person.
Yeah, but then I was like, okay, this is generic white guy. Okay, cool.
Well, you touched on the oral traditions and the folk tales and folklore of the Catawba, and then of course the use of the deer woman story in this episode of Reservation Dogs. Of course, it draws on the deer woman, deer lady, who does appear in multiple native cultures. But I don't know. I'm just curious how you felt. Maybe say a little bit more about, because we touched on this sort of spirituality element with this use of supernatural means, particularly in the case of teaching morality or as a warning, it kind of reminded me a little bit of what, Beckee, you've told me about the Catawba Little People and how they were often, can you say a little bit about the?
Well,
Sharon?
Yeah, I love the Utes stories called Little Wild Indians, and somebody asked me what did they look like, and I said, well, they're larger than fairies and smaller than leprechauns. Because they live in tree stumps. So, but they are, even when I was growing up, you didn't see grass in yards. We had to sweep our footprints out of the yard as we went into the house because we were told if we didn't, the Yinksasuris would know that there were children in the house and they would come in. And back then, you know, there wasn't any such thing as having solid floors because they used the slabs off of the lumber, and there were often cracks in the floors. And they say, well, they would come through and would teach the babies and make them cry at night. So, and Elsa would say she would never sit near a crack when she was growing up. She would sit up in the corner and just pull herself up into a little ball.
But were they not used as warning, making sure you behave as
Yeah,
well?
yeah, and that was to make kids to behave, but also in my own interpretation of it as I got older was also back then, you didn't know who was rambling around in your hat around, who was trying to maybe come in and steal something. So if you swept your footprints off and you go out in the morning, you'd see if somebody was snooping around too.
Well, and then there are other stories like, you know, a giant snake in the river, so don't go swimming by yourself kind of thing. You know, like there are lots of, you know, stories that help to keep you safe.
But it was also the Yinksasuris would, if a stranger came through, they would hit with acorns or something, or if they stopped and took a drink of water, they would break the horse's tail, and that's the time. Or they would cry like a baby to get them off the trails and get them lost. And it was, normally they're saying, well, like Dear Woman, she was getting rid of the bad people. So this was supposedly the Yinksasuris were getting rid of the bad people by getting them lost. And then I'm thinking, well, I guess even bad people have a heart for a child. So if they hear a baby crying, they're going to search them out. So,
Now, something I kind of wanted to point out with Dear Woman too is, and I am not a woman, so I don't want to speak to this too much, but I really appreciated the representation of a powerful woman. And I think that that's something that is shown a little bit more in Indigenous stories as opposed to, you know, European stories too. You know, you had a woman who was, you know, destroying bad men basically, and I think that's pretty cool to highlight for, you know, youth and other people, like, you know, don't take any crap, you know, don't, you know, like, this is not what you have to like put up with. And here is a story that shows them, you know, so like having stronger female role models and not representing women in ways that are belittling was really cool to see in that story, but also something that I've noticed in a lot of other Indigenous stories too. Yeah.
yeah. But she was also very kind towards the little boy.
Yeah.
And giving him good advice, being loving towards him and telling him, you know, to be kind and helpful, and he wouldn't have to worry about it.
So that was, I mean, but that was his spirit guide. So, I mean, that's what she was.
With another question, but we have a comment as well that the producers of Dark Skies were not from the culture. Okay, true, but I believe Chris Ayre was one of the executive producers on that. Probably that's the one who spoke. And we shall remain.
We shall remain.
Yeah, the series.
PBS
Wonderful
series,
PBS
yeah.
series, which also starred West Studio, Cherokee. He was rich. But let's see.
I'm sure he is today too.
Huh?
I'm sure he doesn't have to play Be Rich today too.
Sure. I also noticed the theme of the show of youth and degrees of acceptance, coming to terms with heritage. How does this resonate with today's Native youth from your experiences? Tell us, young people.
That's a great question.
I don't know, because I've always been a part of my generation, so I'm curious from Beckee, in particular, if you see the difference in young Natives
Well,
today.
growing up on the reservation, whenever there were no paved roads, a lot of people didn't even have running water. Even though it was a reservation that's supposed to be, protected by the federal government and everything else, which we know how that's a double-edged sword. Because most people think reservations are these fantastic places that we live. And I'm not downing where I live, because I wouldn't live anywhere else, or would not have changed how I grew up, because that's who I am today because of my experiences. But at the same time, my mother's generation was the first generation that was even allowed to ride the school buses. There wasn't until 1960 that the law in South Carolina was changed where it was legal to marry a Native person.
For non-native person.
Yeah, from a non-native person marrying a non-native. Marrying a native. And I even had an aunt that was going to get married at 59, and the magistrate in Rock Hill would not marry her because she knew who she was. But she was kind enough to tell them where they could go get married. She says, I can't do it because it's against the law, but I can tell you where you go to do it. Yeah.
For me, I've always kind of considered myself both in and out. My mom is from Massachusetts, and so I have a whole other world that I feel like I'm connected to sometimes. And it's, growing up, I didn't really feel different from other people, but I did notice that like there was a Native American coordinator at my elementary school, and I was like, huh, what's that about? And it really dawned on me later as an adult of like, that's a little weird. Like what do we have that for? But like, I think that connecting with your culture is a youth. I don't know. It's interesting to be having grown up in it my whole life, having lived on a reservation my whole life, but then also relate to life off of the reservation too. It's an interesting juxtaposition because you start to see some of the things that are different while you're there versus how things are on the outside too.
You should sort of have to go away from it to see it.
Because it's kind of a bubble.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then once you step out of it, you can see, there's this whole other political ecosystem. There's this whole other culture and everything. But it's also not alien. And I think people sometimes imagine it as being completely foreign or alien, and it's not. It's different, but it's not so different from some other people's experiences too.
I didn't grow up on a reservation. I didn't make my way back until I was about 18, I think. So I didn't have the cultural, I visited, but I didn't have it in my face. I wasn't like involved as much until I was older. So, but I didn't have any kind of childhood for being native.
Yeah.
Like everybody, I just remember as a kid, everybody being like, "Oh my gosh, your skin's so dark. I hate you." But it wasn't
But
like,
not hating it.
right.
Jealous.
Also, like, and I'd be curious to hear what you think too. Like, first of all, I also love to acknowledge my mom's family, because like that's part of who I am too. And I feel like sometimes the appreciation of that comes from my family itself, but from our culture as Catawba a little bit. The other piece too is that you were saying you didn't have like your meat or anything, but our ancestors did.
right.
And hearing the stories from my grandparents, my great grandparents of like some of the like actual traumas that they went through and like horrific things has impacted my life too, because like you kind of inherit some of those anxieties to a degree, I think.
Yeah.
And so like, I think of things in a different way than like all of my friends do. and that's like, that's just kind of become a little bit more apparent to me as I've gotten older. Is that fair to say?
Yes,
Yeah. So like even growing up away from it, I feel like it would be.
You still
impacted
inherit.
by- Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that I want to, and I wanted to find a time to tell this story, so I'm gonna wedge it in here. Which is that I think sometimes when we talk about cultural criticism, like the TV media, and saying that it's a poor representation, we often think that it's that sort of concern is a contemporary concern, that it's particularly a concern of like young people. But the thing is that before Hollywood had even existed, tribes were very concerned about the representation of themselves in movies. In fact, in 1911, so 2 years after Howard Taft came into office, and also when the Champion Studios was established in New Jersey, which would later becomes Universal Studios, Cheyenne and Arapaho sent a group of warriors and leaders to Washington, D.C. to speak with President Taft to tell him that he needs to shut these movies down. The reason why is because they are shocked at how poorly they're being portrayed. They said it's a terrible thing to be lied about and have no recourse to tell the truth. That if these movie makers took some time to learn from Native people, then they might actually have the opportunity to create something worth showing to other people. So they go all the way to DC, not to just coincidentally talk about films and this creation of the Hollywood Indian, these racial stereotypes, but specifically for that purpose. And so I think that is like a piece of historical context I always like to bring into these media conversations, is that like this is something that Native people have been talking about since films were created.
Well, and coincidentally, maybe not, that some of the earliest films, Edison's films, were documentary film of Native dancing, Native traditions, with the idea that they weren't going to exist, so we've got to document it now.
Right.
And Edison's long gone, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, he's an author.
A question from folks here. Everybody could have a question. And also online, if there are any further.
We have one.
I'm just curious, and it doesn't have to do with these two shirts. Are y'all familiar with Alaska Notch?
Alaska.
I've seen the advertisement.
It's just not.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, it draws a lot of light to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is great. But then again, at the last episode, it's like,
Yeah.
say, come in, even though there was this one Indigenous Inuit reporter, who's mad, she's been trying to draw light to it the whole time, and I was just curious as to y'all's view on that.
Would you recommend the show? I'm looking for
I mean, it's a good plot.
Okay.
Well, it's worth talking about.
Yeah.
So-
But it kind of, like, it bothers me.
Okay.
So I feel like it's more in your face than maybe.
So elephant in the room for a second. That was actually a criticism that I would have of Rutherford Falls. I loved the show. I loved Schitt's Creek. I really liked Parks and Rec and things like, and so like I felt like this was a really cool show where I could see like representation of myself. But I feel like it would be a very different show without a Helm's character. And I had to question for a second, like, well, why? What is it? Same concept, kind of like, why is it that this story is being told centered around Ed Helm's character? Like, I can't deny that this is awesome to see the rest of this story too, and clearly, like, it's pivotal to everything else. But like, at least in season 1, because I haven't watched season 2 yet, I felt like it was really coming back around to Ed Helm's character as being like the important piece.
I would, to a certain degree, it wouldn't have gotten made if it wasn't the Ed Helms character. That's sort of I was formulating a question I can't quite get at, but I mean, how do you, I just, maybe it's a philosophical question, how do you balance the real need for cultural authenticity, for true representation, with the desire to make money? Because that's what these shows are.
I think that,
Vehicles for
like,
commercials, as we saw.
I think there's an easy answer, and I feel like one of the reasons why I still like Rutherford Falls is that it came as close as it could to the easy answer that I feel like it could personally.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak for anybody else by saying that, but that's that include Native voices. Yeah. Include the voices of the people whose story you're trying to tell. And they did that. I mean, they have a majority Native writers room, and like you know, so I can't really complain that it was just that note in the back of my head of like, well, okay, if we were trying to tell this story the whole time, and that's actually a real world problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, of like, why does it take, you know, missing children who are not Native to call attention to this story of like why we're
And
experiencing.
why do we need Hillary Swank to be our
Yes,
entree
exactly.
into this community? And that goes back to Dances with Wolves and
Yes.
so on and so forth. And it's just a trope in Hollywood.
It's one of those things that all the movies that have come out and, you know, my brain just left. But there's one movie where they're the avatars.
Avatar.
Avatar. I was trying to figure it out. I love that movie. Actually, we paid to see it 3 different times. And actually bought the video.
We're alone, I'm sure.
Wow.
I'm not laughing at you, Becky, I'm laughing at Sharon.
Yeah, I know. But then it dawned on me, okay, here it is, white people coming in and destroying native lands, and it takes one white man to come in and save the whole population. And I said, whoop, I threw it away.
I do like I heard our guest from last week, I think it was Vincent Chili, who was describing Ed Helms' character as a goofy white ally, which that's a nice term rather than this white savior motif. It's just the goofy guy who's trying to help. I think of myself that way.
So, I mean, taking that kind of context of like the white reporter bringing focus on this, I think that one of the most frustrating moments of my life was when the mass graves were found at the Kamloops school in Canada at the boarding school. And suddenly American newsrooms are like, oh my gosh, this is happening. I don't know about y'all, but I grew up knowing that these schools didn't have playgrounds, they had grave sites, right? And so it was when they were saying breaking news, children buried at boarding schools, it's like, yes, we've been saying that.
Right.
And then what's amazing about it is that the American media was blowing up about the Kamloops school and the fact that there were other such grave sites. And then once the Secretary of Interior declared that they were going to do this fact-finding and truth-telling around American boarding schools, almost no coverage by American media. Suddenly there is,
Yeah.
And that hit me hardest on Twitter, actually, sort of Twitter mutuals. Whenever I saw a tweet that said Native families have known for decades that their children didn't come home. Yeah. And I just absolutely dropped because we've known. I mean, I have a great aunt who went to Carlisle, and it was, you know, I had someone during like a presentation come up to me and said, well, my church every summer goes to Carlisle and is part of it and stuff. And I'm like, you telling me that it's a good thing?
Yeah.
It was astounding. And so
And most people don't even know too, whenever they built the new museum in Carlisle, they dug up children and buried them on top of children. And nobody knows who they are because we have a Catawba child that's buried there, Wade Ayers. And he was supposed to come home. And when they went up there to bring him back home, when they dug into the grave where his marker is, it was a 15-year-old girl.
that happened this summer.
This
Yes.
summer, it happened just this summer.
Yep.
And so they didn't do any more, they didn't do any ground penetration at all to even know how many children were put, and they didn't have any documentation of who was moved or where they were put. They just,
It wasn't.
no.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Mass graves.
Yeah.
Well, if you do have a comment on, in Chickawaukee, success in film to get reservation dogs made with an all division script. Peacock wasn't willing to take that risk, and it's now canceled when it falls, which is also sad. Sad to say.
Well, I was thinking when you asked that question, Reservation Dogs has Taika Waititi,
Yeah.
was massively successful,
Yeah.
and in this scenario, they didn't have a
and
Taika
just
Waititi.
yeah.
Yeah.
Gem in person.
Beautiful man.
Best imagine it.
Oh, yeah, such a good movie.
Any other questions here? Let's see, anything else online? Coming up there. I don't know if that's the time. So, well, I appreciate y'all giving your thoughts, and I think one of the things that I like about these two shows and similar things, and our conversation here is that we certainly are dispelling the stereotype of the stoic, humorless Indian.
Yeah.
That some of the funniest people I know are Native folks. So, all right, any final thoughts?
Give me money so I can make a tribal government sitcom.
Okay, we've got a GoFundMe.
Or just give me money.
Skip the film and just take
Yeah,
it.
I think my plug is support native art, any kind of native arts.
And Becky mentioned it before, November 19th.
Yapi Iswa.
Yeah,
Yapi
November
Ishwa
19th, the Yapi Ishwa Festival on the Catawba Reservation. Probably can Google that and find all the information you want. And speaking of supporting artists, next week we will have an online program with artist Tom Ferris, and we'll have a program here at the center and also online with Brent Learned, who was, as we mentioned a couple of times, was instrumental in the look of the film Prey, the Predator prequel. And his work is on display here, and he'll be joining us next week. Tomorrow, our Lunch and Learn at noon tomorrow, we have Jess Moore from Columbia College, who will be talking about Native American dance traditions. And these programs are listed online. If you go to USC Lancaster and click on Native American Studies, that will take you to our webpage where all of these things are listed as well. And
Saturday.
oh, that's right. Saturday, we have the unveiling, or I guess unveiling, is it unveiling?
This is here.
It's the mural that Alex has painted on the Lucy Pettis Greenway, right behind my house. I'm not complaining. I'm happy there's a mural there. Greenway.
And it is influenced by Catawba folklore. So.
Yes. Is there a time for that, or is it
1 p.m.
1 p.m. on Saturday? All
And
right.
I will be there doing storytelling to go along with the show.
Oh, great. I will be at the Charlotte History Museum talking about the Town Water. All right.
I'm shocked. You've got a non-Catawba talking about Catawba.
Acton.
I make it very clear. Very clear that I'm not the top.
No,
Academic background.
I know, Peter, but I'm making my hair. I mean, just remember me getting my degree, so.
I told you, goofy white owl. All right, well, thank you all for joining us here in person and online, and hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow at noon or next week. And this should go up on YouTube in the very near future, along with our other programs from this month. So again, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers today.